Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. We have a returning author, Keith Thomson, and his book, Paradise of the Damned. One of the things I love about Keith's books is I can recommend them to anybody. It's got shipwrecks, adventure, exploration. Paradise of the Damned is no different. Everybody will like this book. It's a lot of fun. But before we get to Keith, a couple of important announcements. Number one, History Nerds United has become a trio. All right? I'm Brendan. You've heard me talk about producer Mike. Well, it turns out apparently one mic is not enough. We've brought on a second Mike who is going to handle our YouTube channel. If you have not seen it, he's already doing an amazing job. Please head on over to it and take a look at it. Happy to have him on. Three Amigos type situation. It's going to be great, just like it already has been. And speaking of great, I'm going to give a quick shout out to our next few episodes. Just hear me out. Next week, a double episode is coming out with one author, Anna Akbari. Her book, True Crime, there's somebody that we can't mention right off the bat. It has to do with a catfish and finding out the identity of that catfish. So, next week, we had to turn it into 2 episodes. The first, a much longer conversation with Anna, where it's non-spoilers, so you can listen to it and then still go read the book nice and fresh. And then, for when you've read this amazing book, There Is No Ethan, there will be a spoiler episode right after that you can listen to, where I talk to Anna about who Ethan really was. Love this episode. I'm so excited for you to hear it. But please remember, there's going to be 2 different episodes. Don't listen to the spoiler one first. You'll ruin everything. Also got other great authors coming up. Week after that, Max Marshall and his book, Among the Bros, about a fraternity crime story. Love that book. Huge fan of it. Should read that. And then Pulitzer Prize winner Emily Nussbaum comes on to talk about the history of reality TV. No, I'm not just talking about the Kardashians. The entire history of reality TV. Okay, I think I've talked this entire thing up enough. It's time for me to shut up. Let's bring Keith on. And here we are once again. Keith Thomson, his new book, Paradise of the Damned, the true story of an obsessive quest for Eldorado, the legendary city of gold. Keith, thanks so much for coming back on.
Thanks for having me again, especially after last time.
Well, listen, last time, Born to be Hanged, critical success. I went back and kind of looked up some of the reviews because I did my review and kind of saw it, but I haven't gone back in a while. And I mean, they were glowing. Did the critical success of Born to be Hanged kind of inform you about this book? Did it make you think, hey, I want to do kind of another adventure story? Or it was just you already had this idea in your head and here's where it came from?
I started writing this book 3-4 months before Born to be Hanged came out. So I guess it probably only factored into this book insofar as, when I was halfway through, when you get that inner writer voice saying, you suck and, you have no business writing a nonfiction book and, get your real estate license and that sort of thing. At least have some measure of validation or, a slight counter argument.
Now, I loved Born to be Hanged, as we've talked about and everything, but as I was reading Paradise of the Damned, I did feel like you were almost in kind of a groove with this one. It was almost like Born to be Hanged, you were getting it out there, but this one, it's almost kind of like, you're like, I got this locked down. I know this genre. I know how to tell this story. Did it kind of feel like that, or was it just, this is just another book and you were still having the horrible, I'm a fraud thought going through your head?
Well, I appreciate that. I think that Born to be Hanged was the first nonfiction book that I wrote, and I made a fundamental mistake when I was writing it that informed the writing of Paradise of the Damned, which is that I thought it was so cool with Born to be Hanged that I had all these journals written by pirates. There were 7 of them, and I kept quoting them, and I kept doing those block quotes, which is a mistake because, they're hard to read. And, I, as a reader, like a lot of times will just gloss over block quotes. I sort of react the same way like my kids do to a black and white movie, or frankly, I do. It seemed cool from the historian standpoint when I was writing Born to be Hanged. It's like, wow, here's this cool piece of evidence. Can you believe it? Like this pirate wrote this and, while he was on this adventure. It's, what pirates ever write journals and stuff? I think it sort of detracted from the story and the overall escapism that you get from it. I mean, it's not a history book. It's a, more of a work of narrative nonfiction. So, hopefully I just are slightly better this time around.
I wouldn't say better. It was just, like I said, it felt like you were just completely in control of this. And maybe it was, right? Basically, we're talking about, for the most part, Walter Raleigh. He didn't even know how to spell it. So none of us can actually say it wrong, technically. When did you first come across this story and kind of this angle, right? Because there's books on Raleigh all over the place. What made you decide kind of his story and then kind of branch it out about Eldorado?
Well, I didn't know that much about Raleigh. I think, like a lot of people, I knew that he was the guy who got in good with Queen Elizabeth I by throwing his cape down over a puddle so that she wouldn't get her feet muddy, and knew that he had something to do with founding Virginia and that Raleigh, North Carolina was named after him. And I had no idea that he went on this adventure trying to find Eldorado, and much less that he wrote a pretty singular primary source as pre-18th century adventures go. He was a really, really good writer. He's on the short list of people that Shakespeare conspiracy theorists think, might have written Shakespeare's plays for him. He's that good. And so it was really lucky that this document existed to use as a primary source. And at that point, I was off to the races.
Now, when does Eldorado as a myth, as a term, even come into history, right? Because it doesn't start with him. This is something that people have been hearing about for quite a long time when we're talking about the explorers. About when does Eldorado become a, quote-unquote thing for explorers?
Well, I was going to say the Spanish conquistadors first heard about it in around 1529, but it was actually a German conquistador in Venezuela named Dolfinger, I think. As a writer, I never have to pronounce any of these words. Ambrosio Dolfinger. The Germans, they licensed part of the Spanish territory in what's now Venezuela, and he, I think, was the first person to hear the story about a king of a city somewhere in South America in the general vicinity of Venezuela, who every day would slather himself in tortoise fat or some kind of sticky substance, and then his servants would use large straws to blow gold dust onto him, and he would then paddle a canoe out to the center of a lake and plunge in and disperse the gold dust into the water as a sacrifice to the lake god. This German conquistador, Dolfinger, who was out looking to get gold from the indigenous peoples, thought, well, that sounds really good. I would like to meet this king. And it wasn't terribly far-fetched, this story. There was a lot of evidence, a lot of really bright guys, including Dolfinger, came to the conclusion that this was absolutely legitimate, just based on the clues that they had firsthand. And on a broader level, you have, Pizarro finding Cusco, 10, 15 years earlier. And of course, Hernan Cortez conquering Mexico. Between Cortez and Pizarro, there was ample reason to believe that there was another big-ass golden city somewhere around there. So Dolfinger failed to find it, and a series of conquistadors in his wake tried and failed to find it throughout South America, just launching these massive expeditions with like 300 men and another 4,000 indigenous attendants, which probably had no choice in the matter. And they would slog through the Amazon for 1 to 3 years at a clip, everybody dying of disease or starvation along the way. And eventually they sort of homed in on what they called Guyana, which is now the southern part of Venezuela and a couple of the parts of the bordering countries where they felt that this city, Eldorado, was located. And that's when Walter Raleigh came into the picture. He also operated a pirating operation. He was a privateer. He had permission from Queen Elizabeth to pirate Spanish ships. And on one of them, some of his privateers captured a guy named Gamboa, who was the governor, I think, of Venezuela at the time. Probably not. But he knew an awful lot about the Incas, and he, again, what seemed to Raleigh really solid evidence that Eldorado was located in Guyana, and that is what put Raleigh on the scent of Eldorado.
What I always find funny about this time in history is how quickly indigenous people caught on that the freaking Europeans are showing up again. They're going to ask about gold, tell them, yeah, Eldorado totally exists. It's just not here. Keep going. Tell you what, give us money and we'll find somebody to take you there. But by the way, there are tribes out there that might kill you. They're definitely going to kill you. They're going to eat you. But yeah, it's not here. Please leave. Take one of our people and give us some gifts. But it's definitely not here. Don't come back here. Everything is fine. And I know that they had to find that out kind of through trial and error, because a lot of them would get tortured if they said, we're trying to tell you the truth, Eldorado doesn't exist. But you run into that all the time, right? As Indigenous people, it's like, yeah, no, it's not here. It's definitely not. Keep going, though. If you keep going, everything will be fine.
Absolutely. I think that the Indigenous people, that was certainly the single common denominator of all of their directions to the conquistadors is, oh, yeah, just keep going. It's that way, but just safely away from us. I also think that there's ample evidence that a lot of them heard the stories and believed it themselves.
And something that comes out in the book that I read a lot of exploration, and even I kind of forget about this, especially where they were. You're talking about today's Guyana, but basically northern South America. When you do an expedition out there, it's not like, oh, here's 400 guys and we're just going right in there and we're finding it. You basically have to keep sending out smaller and smaller expeditions the further you go down there, because it's too many people. There isn't enough food to sustain everybody. So it's almost like they have to do a whole bunch of mini missions along the way, right? And you've already kind of talked about the disease and everything like that. What is the Amazon like at this point? I mean, the Amazon is still one of the deadliest places you can go. But when they're talking about, all right, we're going into the jungle, this is what's going to happen, what are they running into?
I think first and foremost, they're having difficulty provisioning once they get far from their ships. Paradoxically, there's just not a lot of food. There's not much to eat in the Amazon. The trees, not a whole heck of a lot of fruit that isn't poisonous, and there isn't an awful lot of wildlife that is attainable, and there's even more wildlife that poses an impediment. For instance, jaguars, or 119 species of poisonous snakes or tarantulas or vampire bats, or 20, 30 other deadly critters that I'm not thinking about. So that's really the greatest difficulty, is just finding enough food to keep going. And the keep going is incredibly difficult too, because it's a lot of times you're up against veritable walls of vegetation that have to be slowly and painstakingly hacked out of the way. But it's just a lot harder to do that if you haven't had anything to eat in a couple of weeks. And that was the biggest problem.
And we think of the Amazon River as just this big river water, everything's fine, but it'll also rip up your boats, especially around this time period, real quick if you're not careful and you don't know exactly where you're going.
Right, because it was so difficult to proceed overland. Raleigh's expeditions, and at least half of the expeditions, would take the waterways, the Orinoco River, which is, I don't know, one of the 10 or 15 largest in the world, goes across South America around the point where the southern part of Venezuela, but it has myriad tributaries. It just looks like if you dump a bowl of spaghetti on the floor, that's what a map of the distributaries and tributaries of the Orinoco looks like. And that's how a lot of the Eldorado hunters proceeded, because it was so much easier to go by boat. The problem is they have no idea where the shoals are, where the boat shredding rocks are. And without Indigenous guides, they were lost, literally, and often with the guides as well.
Now, we've talked about how horrible the Amazon is, but you just mentioned it. There's somehow also a lot of Indigenous people along the way. I think a lot of people would think this time and period, everything we just talked about, there wouldn't be a lot of people along the way. But while there is all of those horrible things, there's still plenty of Indigenous people if they were willing to actually talk to you, I guess I should say.
Sure, it's improbable, but pretty much every 50 miles or so, and granted, 50 miles can sometimes take 10 days, to go. But yeah, there's another village or even cities of people that over the millennia have managed to survive and flourish in many cases. And they were around, and in most cases they cooperated with the English, and they also cooperated with the Spanish, because they were forced to, and helped the expeditions.
I do want to talk about one specific set of people, Indigenous people. That would be the folks who apparently had faces in their chests. So they did not have heads. Their faces were in their chest, in between their shoulder blades. And This sounds like something that one person would make up, but this actually kind of comes up a few times that there are these people who everybody swears exists, and they don't have heads, they just have faces in their chest, right?
Yeah, at one point, Walter Raleigh, in his first expedition in search of Eldorado, was contemplating ascending a series of giant waterfalls, which would take a lot of doing. And he had a relatively small force. I guess this is what you were referring to before. He had, I think, 50 or 60 guys who'd branched off from his larger force. And his guide said, well, I don't think you want to go over these falls, even if you could, with this number of men, because even with your swords and your guns, you're going to come up against the Iwe Panoma, who are these people that don't have heads, but their faces are on their chests. And Raleigh had heard about them before. There was a book previously, The Travels of John Mandeville, an English adventure book, maybe in the 15th century, give or take a century, where Mandeville had described exactly such a people somewhere else, I think in Africa. And I think that there was some mention of them in Herodotus. So I guess this wouldn't be unanalogous to like a Yeti or a Bigfoot sighting. I don't think that Raleigh quite believed it, but he decided not to proceed really because of weather. The rainy season was about to pounce on him. So he turned back at that point.
And the focus on Raleigh, especially everything we've just talked about, the hell that is the Amazon and trying to get there, he's specifically tempted by Eldorado because of his own background. He is not one of those super rich English gentlemen that can just throw money around, and if it doesn't work out, he'll be perfectly fine and he can do this and he can do that. He's kind of the underdog his entire life, right? Like you talked about how he got in with Queen Elizabeth, but that didn't mean everybody liked him and everyone was looking for him to succeed, right?
Yeah, his family had been nobility once upon a time, but that sort of faded away a good couple generations before he was born. This is in Devon. And he also was the youngest of 5 sons. He would be lucky to inherit like a hog pen at his family's farm. So when he went to Queen Elizabeth's court after many years in the military, he really was an underdog because that is a place that, your lineage is more important than anything. And he didn't have really that much to speak of. And he also couldn't afford to just mount his own expeditions like one of his rivals, Robert Dudley, the son of Robert Dudley, Queen Elizabeth's childhood friend and allegedly her lover. He could afford the best of everything, the best ships, the best pilots and navigators, and Raleigh was a scrapper.
Were you ever tempted to actually go down to the Amazon just to check this out? I know sometimes authors are like, I need to see what I'm writing about, but please tell me you weren't crazy enough to try and parachute into the Amazon jungle to try and see where Raleigh might have been.
I can't tell you that. I did try.
How'd it go? How'd it turn out?
Well, I knew that I was going to have a very difficult time getting into Venezuela just because of the current situation with the Venezuelan government or lack thereof. I knew that even if I could get in through a back door, which was a possibility, that it would be dangerous, especially the areas that I wanted to go to along the Orinoco River where Raleigh went. But a good deal of the story takes place on the island of Trinidad and the Caribbean island. It's only about 7 or 8 miles across the Gulf of Paria from the western coast of Venezuela. And it's where Raleigh staged both of his expeditions and where another of Raleigh's chief rivals, Antonio de Brio, also was the governor there. So a lot of the story in Paradise of the Damned takes place on Trinidad. So I thought, all right, well, I'll go to Trinidad, which I did. And at the very least, I'd like to see the Orinoco Delta that's just massive, like twice the size of Spain, opening from the Atlantic to the Orinoco River. It's only, like I said, like a 6 or 7 mile jaunt across the relatively placid Gulf of Paria, and then just a few miles down the coast to get a look at it. And much of the story takes place there too. Raleigh and some of his rival explorers and some of his people had all sorts of adventures in the Orinoco River Delta. And it's pretty singular. I thought it'd be really cool to just see it. And I got to Trinidad literally the first week it was opening up after the pandemic. And that's important because nobody in the tourist industry had worked for a couple of years. Trinidad took their lockdown really seriously. So I figured, all right, well, there are charter fishing people that charge $500 to take somebody out here and fish. They don't even have to do any fishing. They can save money on bait if they just cruise over to the Orinoco River Delta. But I couldn't find anybody, even like the really desperate kind of guys, like one guy who was living on his boat because his third wife had just thrown him out, and he was about to owe a third set of alimony, and he just was reluctant to take me there because there are just so many pirates as a result of all the kerfuffles in Venezuela. A lot of the Venezuelan oil workers who are now out of work are pirating, and they just thought it was simply too dangerous to go anywhere close to the coast. They wouldn't do it for any amount of money. So I wasn't able to get there, and it's unfortunate. It would have been fun to have a jungle adventure, but maybe next time.
I mean, so amazing historical irony. You were not able to go check out a book about a pirate because of current pirates. That's basically what I'm taking from that story.
There you go. Yeah, truth kicks fiction's ass every day.
Now, the other half of it is a good amount of this takes place in England as well. Have you been to England? Have you kind of seen where Raleigh was in the Tower? Anything else out, where he was born? Ever go there? Because I feel like that's way easier under the circumstances.
I did. I went to the Tower of London. Raleigh spent somewhere between 13 and 14 years there, and you can see it's an apartment. I mean, it was a prison complex, but he had a 500 square foot apartment where he spent way, way, way more time than he would have liked. And I think if he had to do it all over again, he would have spent all of his time in Dorset at Sherborne, the estate that Queen Elizabeth gave to him. But when he fell out of favor with Queen Elizabeth in 1595, he contrived to go find Eldorado to get back into favor and to pay off some of his debts. So he ended up, as a result, in prison instead. But I also went out to see Sherborne, and it really is a castle right out of a fairy tale, and it's quintessential English countryside. Raleigh had all sorts of innovations like running water and large windows that admitted freakishly high volume of daylight, both of which were innovations at the time, all sorts of things. That place is really central to the story because his is a Faustian bargain to some extent, and that's what he gave up.
If it wasn't for Eldorado, do you think Raleigh's story ends differently? Do you think that his obsession with Eldorado led him down that path where he wasn't going to be able to come back? Or do you think he just had too many enemies to begin with, that if it wasn't his obsession with Eldorado and the unsuccessful missions, they would have found some other way to end him, so to speak?
It's a great question. It's really hard to know. There are a lot of variables, and I think that one of the most underrated is that he was right. I mean, there was a vast, vast amount of gold discovered a couple hundred years after he died, 5 miles from where he was looking. I don't know, had he just stumbled on a 15-pound nugget like a German prospector did in the 19th century, leading to that area becoming the largest gold producer in the world at the time, then his story might have ended up very differently. If he hadn't gotten Eldorado in his blood, he founded Virginia without ever once going there. Queen Elizabeth needed him around, and he just sent people in his place. He might have tried to pursue something there, and we know how that ended up for some of his Virginia colonists, right? So that could have been bad. I mean, he was a guy who was naturally curious and a born adventurer, and the sort of person who kind of can't go anywhere without really wondering, really dying to know what's around the next corner. So he would almost certainly have, been itching to try some other gambit or some other grand adventure, and maybe it would have succeeded. Maybe he would have followed in the footsteps of Cortez or Pizarro. He might have been the English humane version of those guys, and his story would have had a really happy ending. But yeah, I certainly don't see him ever saying, gee, this is the Sherborne and here in Dorset is the greatest place ever. I'm so happy here with my loving wife and son. I'll just stay here and read my books. He would have gone somewhere. So I don't know how it would have ended. He was a pretty smart guy, and he was an exquisite researcher. So I think it's as likely as not that he would have stumbled on the gold nugget or found something comparable.
There's a lot of different historical opinions on Raleigh. It sounds like you came away with more a positive thinking about him, that he was naturally intellectual, but also interested in a lot of different things, very curious. Is that how you felt about him once you finished all your research on him?
It sounds ridiculous. I'm not a fan of Raleigh, but I'm not. I mean, it's what I'm saying is it sounds ridiculous that I really try to be objective about these guys, but he was an incredibly bright guy. He was incredibly learned. He taught himself Spanish, college dropout when he just wanted to learn more about Spanish exploration, and the books weren't translated. So he learned Spanish so he could read the books in the only language that they were available, and he read all the time. It's just, unless he was making that up, the sort of Raleigh detractors who say, well, he wasn't a bright guy, he was just a pompous ass, the evidence seems to conclusively say otherwise.
Now, Keith, you've already had to answer this question once before last episode. You know what it's going to be. There are misguided people who don't like history. They might look at your book and say, well, it seems like, an adventure and everything, but it's nonfiction, so it's history. History is boring. If I sat one of those people in front of you and they said, why should I read Paradise of the Damned? What would you say?
I wonder what I said last time, because I remember having a coherent thought, which isn't the case now. I would sort of agree with them that history a lot of the time is boring because that's how it's presented. It's, we all have those flashbacks to sixth grade when we had the thick as a mattress textbook where the history, exciting chapters like the American Revolution are presented as if a tool for, to help insomniacs fall asleep. And I think that if it focuses on interesting characters and their objectives and the same sort of things that people like novels, then history can be like reading a really thrilling novel. And I think I've personally gravitated to it from writing novels because it's just that much cooler because it actually happened. And the truth stranger than fiction thing.
Absolutely, Keith. I think it's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks again.
And that's it for this episode. Keith, thank you so much for coming back on Paradise of the Damned. Go out and get it, folks. It's fantastic. You're going to love it. I know I say this every episode, but please hit us up. Email us, brendan@historynerdsunited.com. Love to hear from you. Hit us up on social media. We are on Threads now. We're also on Twitter. I'm not going to call it X. Facebook, Instagram. Hit up the website. Go to YouTube. Maybe give Mike a hey, welcome to HNU. Glad to have you aboard. Let him know you're happy he's there. Watch the videos and follow, download, and tell all your friends. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.